So which chapters are hot right now and which ones are less so? Let's talk about the strongest and weakest Space Marine chapters in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and more specifically we're going to be doing a tier list of the chapter strength in 9th edition, talking through how each of the chapters is ranking up in the current game at the moment, and going through a few of the stronger options from each codex in turn. Space Marines in general maybe aren't having the best time of it at the moment, with even the strongest entries on this list only getting to the point where they're kind of competing with the mid-tier armies, but a fair bit has changed for them over the past half year or so, Armour of Contempt becoming a thing, and also a bunch of points cost changes and updates in the Nephilim update. With all that in mind, I've ranked them into 5 different tiers. I will start out with tier 5 the lowest, and go forward to tier 1 the strongest Space Marine chapters around. Starting down at the lower end though, I think it might not be to too many people's surprise that the Imperial Fists still seem to be performing the worst. They really didn't enjoy the translation from 8th into 9th, and Games Workshop pretty much hasn't helped them out in any way since. It does seem to me if ever there's a chapter that's in need of a buff at the moment, it's the Imperial Fists. Across Nephilim they're certainly one of the least played chapters, and only scraping into a dismal 24% win rate at tournaments when most Space Marines factions are averaging around about 37. The Imperial Fists just seem to have quite a lot of bad things come together for them. Artillery got heavily nerfed from 8th to 9th, and then again with the barrage change in the balanced data slate. Their chapter tactic means that you want to spam loads of bolters, but unfortunately most bolter platforms just aren't really the Space Marines' most efficient ways of dealing damage, and they even had their super doctrine toned down. Only applying to strength 7 or more weapons means that you can't make heavy bolters utterly lethal on turn 1. Despite this, they do have a few other things going for them. The Eye of Hypnoth for wound rerolls can be quite a nice, handy extra buff for any gun lines. A captain with that and rerolling ones to hit and wound is pretty potent. There's a Warlord trait that can rustle you up a few extra CP. They've got a few damage dealer stratagems such as Tank Hunters and Bolter Drill, and plus some options for stacking saves on big chunky units like Terminators or Centurions, and making them excessively hard to shift from light cover. Unfortunately, I would just say that compared with any of the other Space Marine supplement books, Games Workshop just really hasn't given them very much. The Super Doctrine's a bit underwhelming and only relevant against certain armies. Their psychic powers are pretty bad across the board. Most of their Warlord traits are underwhelming, and their stratagems, even the good ones, seem to be a bit on the overcosted side. Hopefully whenever the next Space Marine Codex drops, it'll give the Imperial Fists a bit of help. I think you'd only really need some very efficient bolter damage dealers, and the Imperial Fist will become a lot more relevant to make them even nastier. Next up, I'm moving on to tier 4, and we have the Raven Guard here. I'd say that these guys do have more interesting stuff going for them than the Imperial Fists, but still they're a chapter that's had almost no good tournament performance throughout the entirety of 9th edition, Nephilim or not. Their sneaky spec op tricks and movement advantages just don't seem to be selling them enough compared with other chapters. In Warzone Nephilim, they've got around a 37% win rate, a little bit lower than average compared with the Codex Space Marines chapters, and a bit worse than most of the Divergent ones. Again, they see a very small player base, around 12 players in Nephilim, and interestingly quite a lot of those players seem to take successor chapters rather than the core chapter tactic, mixing things like Hungry for Battle, Whirlwind of Rage, or Born Heroes. I do think that the Raven Guard have some really big, interesting, punchy options. You can deep strike any infantry unit with a command point, maybe most famously used for things like Centurions, who can be very lethal up close but are hard to get into combat, or perhaps even things like Eradicators or Aggressors. Vanguard Veterans are another interesting unit with a bunch of mobility options. They really quite like the first turn pre-game move that Raven Guard can get, so you can easily key up for first turn charges. And you've got the potential to use the Master of Ambush Warlord traits to get a threatening unit into a first turn attack position on the enemy as well. That could be nice from anything from Eradicators to Blade Guard Veterans, or again things like Aggressors. Overall, it does seem that people are pretty underwhelmed by their core chapter tactic though, the -1 to hit at range, otherwise they wouldn't be swapping it out for more melee might. The character thing is pretty handy against some lists, say for example knights with lots of big characters, but is kind of useless against others when all the characters are hidden. And again, like the Imperial Fists, there are entire sections of the Codex that just seem a bit rubbish. I'm not a particularly big fan of either their psychic powers or their relics. Still though, I do think that they're in a better place than the Imperial Fists are, but remain one of the more challenging Space Marine chapters to play. Moving on, we come to Tier 3, Perhaps middle tier for Space Marine chapters, where I've chosen to rank Ultramarines, Deathwatch, White Scars and Salamanders, all chapters that have some really nice choices and some very powerful damage dealing or utility moves, but just maybe not quite as many outstanding things to make you play them compared with some of the other top choices. First up we have the Deathwatch, an army that has been a bit up and down over the course of 9th edition. They're sitting on a 39% win rate at the moment. I played a fair bit more than Raven Guard and have managed to get one podium placing in tournaments in the Nephilim era. They do operate very differently to a lot of Space Marine chapters. They have some very efficient kill team troops that they can be taking, mixing some ranged options for holding backfield objectives with some aggressive damage dealers, mixing in things like Vanvets and bikes. You can build a very solid shooty Dreadnought castle with a 5+ invul shield, plus things like re-rolling wounds against a single datasheet, which is awesome for Volkite Contemptors. They get to choose the order of their doctrines, which allows you to put the Assault Doctrine earlier, potentially giving you better value out of things like Lightning Claws or Thunderhammers. You can make units change into the other chapter's tactics, perhaps most powerfully borrowing things from White Scars like Advance and Charge to get a unit across the board very quickly and into combat. They've got good Psychic, including a nice melee buff and a 5+ Feel No Pain. The Beacon Angelis can teleport units around the table, and perhaps more recently their Army of Renown that they got last year. That can allow the entire army worth of kill teams to jump between different chapter tactics, and also potentially allow some really big damage punches. 3 CP for auto wounding against a certain target can just hoover out a ton of damage. Overall, I think the Deathwatch are a really quite interesting army with lots of interesting options that you can play in different ways. Perhaps it's just the raw efficiency of the units that seems to be holding them back a bit, and maybe just being forced in some slightly mixed or unhelpful combinations on those kill teams, which means that they're very efficient for doing some things, but you might wind up taking a bunch of models that you might not necessarily have wanted that much. It is pretty sad that special issue ammunition is pretty underwhelming right now as well. Of all the mechanics in the codex to build around, that's probably not the best one. Next up we have the Ultramarines, again an army with a ton of interesting options, but it doesn't seem to be one of the most go-to armies for competitive Space Marines currently. A 37 win rate and quite a good player representation, 66 players in Nephilim, though 0 podium placings. I feel that maybe with Ultramarines there might be a small amount of dilution for newer players who often might pick this up as their first faction. Ultramarines are pretty much one of the poster boys of 40k, but even allowing for that they don't seem to be doing amazing. Again, they do have plenty of strong options within the codex. Their super doctrine to move and shoot as if stationary is really nice. It allows them to rapid fire bolters pretty efficiently. Plus it's particularly nice for things like Devastators or Heavy Eradicators moving around. Not taking a -1 penalty on those guns is pretty big. The Seal of Oath is a pretty reasonable relic pickup. It allows you to get big rerolls against a certain enemy target and farm that out to nearby core units. There's a ton of interesting characters that you can field. Gilliban and Calgar both seem fairly efficient, and I do quite like Calgar's Victrix Guard as well. They seem to be quite nice little tanky units that can help defend objectives. Otherwise they've got a nice command point farming warlord trait. Targarius is quite handy for making one unit -1 to hit each turn, and their redeployment stratagem at the start of the game can be pretty game changing. They can do the trick where they deploy some threatening units like Infiltrators or Invicta Tactical Warsuits up the front, and then if the enemy gets first turn then they can pull them back for a command point or two, and basically have the best of both worlds of either alpha striking or hiding. Despite all this, I feel like they do have their weak points. The chapter tactic is a bit underwhelming, and it maybe just doesn't come together in so much raw damage or mobility as some other chapters. They really do need to play into their character synergy and flexibility more than other chapters. Still though, certainly not terrible, they do have plenty of interesting options. Next up we have Salamanders. They used to be the kings of early 9th edition, though that did drop off a bit when Eradicators and Aggressors both got nerfed. At the moment though, they don't seem to be doing too bad. 43% win rates and 55 players in Nephilim. The Salamanders are all about bringing relatively slow moving raw power and durability. The best thing about them I think is their +1 to wound for Melters and Flamers, making things like Eradicators, Flamestorm Aggressors or multi-melter attack bikes into real forces to be reckoned with. Their chapter tactic got a bit interesting as well. In Nephilim it now counters wound rerolls. Against some armies that matters a lot, against some armies not that much. It can be very nice if, say, you're fighting against enemies with lightning claws. Otherwise, I do think that quite a lot of their codex sections have some pretty helpful things in them. They've got +1 to wound for a command point, flamer buffs to allow max hits out of a unit, which is very scary combined with the +1 to wound. They can build a super tanky Smash Captain on bike with the extra toughness and the -1 to wound. The psychic powers are pretty decent, with Fire Shield and Drake Skin making one unit abnormally hard to kill, and I think Armour of Contempt did help them a fair bit. It made things like Aggressors or Assault Centurions without invul saves into far more tempting picks, both units that really epitomise the Salamanders playstyle and really quite like having their Flamers. For army weaknesses, I do think that they're a little bit limited on the mobility front. Lots of raw power, but with short ranges, and nothing that much in terms of movement tricks. They might just struggle to bring it to bear. They might wind up being an army that takes a whole load of punishment before they even get to attack, though when they do get to counter-strike, they can hit back the enemy very, very hard. They've definitely got their merits. Kind of interesting to see the win rate on them quite this high. It'll be interesting to see if anyone actually manages to convert that into tournament success. Moving on, we've got White Scars. Tournament stats wise, they seem to be in a fairly similar place to the Salamanders, a 42% win rate, 89 players total in Nephilim, but no podium placings whatsoever. I'd say the biggest reason to play White Scars are their chapter tactic and their punchy assault doctrine. Advance and charge and everything can really get your units exactly where they need to be. And then everything goes into super mega murder mode as soon as you get the assault doctrine on the go. That gives you +1 damage on the charge and turns things like lightning claws into damage to blenders. It does seem to be a bit of a meme that White Scars armies tend to hide a bit in the first couple of turns and then charge out third turn to do some major damage. Perhaps standout units are things like Vanguard veterans with lightning claws, bike chaplains where you can get some spectacular damage, and possibly Blade Guard veterans as well, who really like the movement boost. Otherwise, their psychic discipline's pretty nice. A jump pack librarian is often a reasonable choice. The Plume of the Plains Runner is quite a nice buff for getting units into combat. You can have 3d6 drop the lowest charges, which can potentially help you out of Deep Strike if you choose to use that. And Corsaro Khan is another very common pick in a lot of White Scars armies. Getting you +1 strength on nearby units is pretty savage. It does seem that these combinations, though, aren't really getting them to see play quite as much as some of the other options on the table. I feel that perhaps with Black Templar, Space Wolves and Blood Angels all looking so good at the moment, they're perhaps taking the Assault Army crown away from the White Scars, who previously have been very, very solid. Still though, definitely an army that can have good success with a good list in capable hands. Moving on to Tier 2 and getting into some of the stronger chapters right now. Here I've chosen to rank the Black Templars, Space Wolves and Iron Hands. All armies with reasonable win rates, reasonable number of players, seem to be taking some podium places, and again have a ton of very scary looking things that they can bring to the table. Starting out with the Codex Marines, we have the Iron Hands. Currently they've got a 44% win rate and 53 players in Nephilim, having taken 2 podium spots including 1 tournament win. Iron Hands continue to do a whole bunch of things right, despite their many nerfs that they suffered since their codex dropped in 8th. Just about each section of their codex seems very strong, and they're always going to be one of the best chapters to consider if you are taking some big vehicles along. The Iron Hands really do have an absolute ton of things that they can choose to field. Their chapter tactic on its own isn't too bad with the Feel No Pain, though quite a lot of people like to run them as successors as well, perhaps combining things like Master Artisans, which is handy at range and in melee, with something like perhaps with Whirlwind of Rage or Born Heroes for more combat damage. As mentioned, they do have really quite a lot of support for vehicles. Their Devastator Doctrine allows them to reroll ones and get them extra AP. That's really nice as you can access it for 1 command point later in the game on big units like Gladiator tanks or maybe even the mighty Astrius. Their psychic powers can make their saves better, which is quite nice in Armour of Contempt, and they've got a fair few different ways in which they can repair things between psychic powers or Soup Top Tech Marines. As well as that, for more specific stuff, they can get a Character Relic Contemptor Dreadnought for a gun turret that you can't shoot. Target Protocols and Student of History are both great Warlord traits. Turn 1 Drop Pod Devastators with Grav Cannons and Multi-Melters seem to be the order of the day with Iron Hands. They can jump out and shoot with no penalty, rerolling ones to hit. Maybe combine all that with a couple of melee damage dealers, perhaps some Vanguard veterans with Lightning Claws or Thunderhammers. And you've got a list that's got a ton of range damage and also can take a bite out of enemies in combat as well. Overall, they have been doing pretty solidly throughout all of 9th edition, and it seems like they're not doing any worse at the moment. I'd certainly argue that they're perhaps one of the strongest out of the more codex, less divergent Space Marine chapters. Next up, we've got the Black Templars, a 42 win % in tournaments, though at least relatively widely played. Again, they've had a bit more success than most in Nephilim, with a couple of podium placings at grand tournaments. The Black Templars have been a fairly punchy force to be reckoned with since their codex dropped around the end of last year. Their chapter tactic gives them some mortal wound protection, which is very nice with all the sources of mortal wounds available in 9th, plus some fairly easy charges as well, always good for combat marines. Generally, most Black Templar armies seem to want to build around some foot-slogging marines moving up the field. Quite often they're Crusader squads, though they could use things like Terminators, Van Vets or Blade Guard veterans, and then support those units well with things like their unique Chaplain litanies, Helbrecht and Grimaldus, and maybe making them harder to kill with things like their Relic Bearers to tank extra damage, and then perhaps res the slain Relic Bearer with an Apothecary. Particularly in Nephilim, the Crusader squads got very efficient as they chopped the points cost down for a bunch of their upgrades. They do seem like a unit that you'd want to field multiple of if you're playing Black Templars now. They've got a few really handy relics in their arsenal, including the one that gives you a 4+ invul save for a turn, and the Crusader Helm, which allows you better auras and also putting a unit in the Assault Doctrine. Finally, their vows can give you some useful buffs to your entire army, though I might argue that since Armour of Contempt happened, the 5+ invul vow is a bit less relevant. Usually it's now only going to come into effect if you're shot by AP-4 things, and it means that you can't get light cover, which is actually very relevant when Armour of Contempt is a thing. They also don't have an absolute ton of ranged fire support as well, so you're mainly just going to be going off base Space Marine stat lines with that, though they usually can be okay for things like Eradicators and Redemptors. Still though, in general the Black Templars can put a whole load of OBSEC bodies up the centre of the board, and with 5+ feel no pains and things going around, they can be quite hard to bring down. Lastly for this tier we have the Space Wolves. I feel like they're an army that's seen quite a lot of improvements in Nephilim. They've got a 44% win rate at tournaments at the moment, are really quite well represented with around 100 players so far, have taken 3 podium placings in grand tournaments, and also seem to be winning quite a lot of smaller events. I think perhaps the biggest things that have improved their lot recently are some very nice points cuts to key units, particularly Wolfen getting cheaper makes them a lot more usable, and actually Skyclaws have become a really savage little combat unit, a really quite nice assault squad with +1 attack, which do seem to do very well for their cheap points cost. In general though, for the core of the army, Space Wolves are all about the raw melee might. Both their chapter tactic and super doctrine amp up their combat damage, and then they'll usually want to back that up with things like chapter masters or chaplains for re-rolling hits in melee, plus potentially rune priests also helping out with awakening their instincts and making the enemy fight last. Space Wolves are a one that can be run quite well as successors too. Standard Space Wolves do get a few nice options including characters and particularly their unique dreadnoughts, but a lot of people do quite like to run them with the Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage combo just to make their damage even harder, and they do have the option for double exploding 6s whenever they can activate their combat doctrine. On top of that, they can easily get +1 to wounding combat and get their doctrine early with a stratagem as well, and they do have access to a lot of nice fights last options, including the Armour of Rus or Judiciars, who have a great big 6-inch heroic intervention using the Space Wolves stratagem. Overall, really solid as a combat chapter, got a lot of good things going for them, including plenty of fights last and raw damage. Maybe the biggest issues are actually getting them into melee in the first place, plus lacking apothecaries I think is a bit of a disadvantage within the Space Wolves codex. They are really quite a nice one for resurrecting fighty combat units. Finally though, we get into the strongest chapters around, and currently top of the tree for Space Marines right now, I'd rank Dark Angels and particularly Blood Angels. The Angels of Death seem to be enjoying Armour of Contempt and Nephilim more than most, even though admittedly at the moment both of these armies can be a bit monodimensional. Dark Angels do seem to be doing pretty well, a 45% tournament win rate, a big 142 players in Nephilim, and 5 podium placings at events. Perhaps more so than just about any other chapter out there, I do feel that just about every section of their rules is really strong, with good warlord traits, psychic powers, relics, stratagems and more. First up, Grim Resolve can give them +1s to hit, either for static gunline units or melee units that get to fight back against the enemy. They've got flexible combat doctrines that can help out the different wings of their army in different turns, and I think at the moment, perhaps more than anything, the real top tier builds for Dark Angels do tend to be very, very Deathwing heavy, making use of their unique Vanguard detachment for a whole bunch of OBSEC Terminators, and OBSEC Terminators that are only ever wounded on a 4+, thanks to their nice inner circle rule. You can't really go too far wrong by taking something like 30-odd Terminators and then supporting them with the great characters on offer, things like Azrael, Ezekiel, and the Ravenwing Apothecary, and perhaps a Deathwing Ancient with the Pennant of Remembrance for -1 damage as well. Ezekiel went down in points cost recently, and he makes Interromancy powers very easy to cast. They can have the enemy fighting last, Righteous Repugnance for full rerolls, and play games with auras and OBSEC. And after the Terminator lineup, the Deathwing Knights also got a very big boost in Nephilim. They don't get objectives secured unless you have the rights of War Warlord trait, but their melee damage is just apocalyptic, essentially Thunderhammer attacks that are hitting on 2s rather than the normal 4s. In general, I do feel that the strongest lists just tend to be very Deathwing skewed. It does feel a little bit painful to be building out to add other units in with a patrol or something, with so many good character upgrades on offer. If you do take some Ravenwing along though, they can have some really nice moves with multi-melter attack bikes for early damage dealing, Obsec bikes with a 5+ invul, and quite a lot of good support stratagems and options as well. Overall, a very strong army. I'd probably place them tier 1 with Deathwing, maybe more dropping down to tier 2 if you built around their Green Wing or Raven Wing. Perhaps one weakness that they have in Nephilim is that their very easy secondary objectives got toned down quite a lot. These are now far more in line with the other Space Marine ones. Finally and lastly, we come to the Sons of Sanguinius. The Blood Angels have had a bit of a renaissance in recent times. They're flying high with a 47% tournament win rate right now, a big 206 players in Nephilim, so the most played Space Marine faction, and have also got 5 podium placements as well. They are doing okay at some events. Again, with the Dark Angels, I think you could criticise the Blood Angels for being just a little bit monodimensional. The top lists almost always seem to spam out a good 3 big units of the Brutal Sanguinary Guard, a ridiculously efficient combat data sheet that does just about everything well, fast moving, a 2+ save with Armour of Contempt, great melee damage with the +1 to wounds from the Blood Angels, excellent support options with +1 to hit, heroic intervention, and even -1 to hit in combat as well. It does kind of feel like Codex Sanguinary Guard with support options more than anything else, but at least the Blood Angels are being able to punch up with the other factions of 40k, and not feeling quite as much in the shade as perhaps some of the other Codex Space Marine ones. Besides the near-mandatory core of Sanguinary Guard, you can also take along some Death Company. Potentially with Forlorn Fury, you could be breaking something very hard turn 1. Assault Marines are now a fair bit cheaper and more usable too, kind of similar to the Space Wolves. The points reductions for them really helps. They could be quite good utility units or bullying light infantry. The Sanguinary Guard have got some very nice support options too. The Jump Pack Ancient with a +2-inch movement gives you a lot more threat range. A Sanguinary Priest with a Jump Pack can resurrect models closer to the enemy for even shorter charges, and plus he gives you a Feel No Pain and also puts a unit in the Assault Doctrine early for the Blood Angels' extra attacks. Then maybe combine them with some sort of fighty Captain or Chapter Master, or maybe even Dante. A few troops to hold objectives, maybe some Phobos, and perhaps some range support to deal a little bit of damage to heavy hitters, maybe things like Eradicators or multi-melter attack bikes. For weaknesses though, I think it's maybe not too hard to find some. Blood Angels are a bit monodimensional at the moment, basically Sanguinary Guard being shored up by an excellent Chapter Tactic and Doctrine. Anything that kills them well will counter Blood Angels pretty nicely, high AP damage to weapons, mortal wounds, or things like Death Guard with -1 damage and some fights last. A lot of the rest of the codex just isn't really all that standout either. I'd say their Warlord traits, relics, stratagems and psychic powers are all mainly just okay rather than great. The army is kind of carried by the raw power of the +1 to wound and the +1 to charge. Still though, overall one of the best Space Marine chapters in 9th edition. Quite cool to see the Blood Angels being pretty usable at the moment. And still a bit of a blast to play with fast-moving, hard-hitting jump Space Marines, even if the codex isn't particularly well internally balanced. So there we have it then, probably Blood Angels and Dark Angels leading the way, followed up by Space Wolves, Black Templars and Iron Hands, and perhaps more of the codex compliant Space Marine chapters following a bit beyond that. As always though, I do know that these tier lists are a bit arbitrary. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes as to which chapters should take the top spot. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. There is a Space Marine Codex rumoured to be coming out sometime early in 2023, so maybe these rankings might have to change a bit. I feel like in particular most of the Codex ones do seem to be struggling compared with the Special Divergent chapters. Something to help those out could be pretty nice. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do generally keep the regular 40k videos coming pretty regularly, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to quickly mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's what allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.